Welcome to the Creative Condition podcast, the show where I, Ben Talon, illustrator and writer, explore human creativity and invite people from the creative industry and far beyond to share their story of creativity, both the nature and the nurture, the chaos and the calm. Creativity is a fundamental pillar of human happiness, a vital ingredient in the solutions to all of our problems, but so often misunderstood. Little by little, I'm building an archive of valuable stories, experiences, and tips to help you maximise yours. The show is supported by founding sponsor and B Corp, Illustration X. Take a look at their stunning range of illustrators and animators now at illustrationx.com. If you like the music for the show, it's by Dirty Freud, who you can listen to on Spotify and all good music streaming services.
When I was at the retreat, just so happened there was an article that came out. I think it was, Justin actually talked to us about it. It was maybe in the BBC or something, about a literal, I think it was a white supremacist who did mushrooms and then was no longer a white supremacist. He's like, oh, that was stupid. I took mushrooms, I realized that that is so stupid. And so you sort of see people, who really need it, need to be able to open up and to be able to be less angry and stuff like that on a just larger social level.
Today is a topic I never thought I'd cover. Things are about to get trippy. I'm talking to Negin Farsad, an acclaimed Iranian-American writer, comedian, director and actor, about a psychedelic retreat. And we're joined by Justin Townsend, CEO and head facilitator of Myco Meditations, the longest running legal psilocybin retreat in Jamaica, to get into all things creativity, well-being, laughs and slaying personal dragons. This is the Creative Condition. Hello and welcome to the Creative Condition podcast. My name is Ben Talon. I'm your host. How are you doing? I hope you're well. I hope you enjoyed the last episode with Gush Monday, founder of Bulletproof, a fantastic creative agency based in London. That was an inspiring, fiery chat. And I love people when they've got a chip on their shoulder, as Gush described it, but they're fired by some early adversity and they're determined. And I think those people can teach us a lot about overcoming the dramas in our lives. And I, for one, need to take a moment and take a lesson from that as I tackle 200 some copies of the Creative Condition book, which is out on April 11th. I have a mountain of things to do. I have a box city of books for you Kickstarter backers in my front room, in my studio, in my loft, in my mind. It's hard work. Beware the independent publishing route. I mean, it's joyous and all that, but it's challenging at times as well. There's a lot to think about. So that's where I'm at today. I have packing labels coming out of my eyes. I have, it's waking me up at night. It's getting that bad. We'll get there. I hope you're well. Before I prattle on any longer, I just want to say a very big thank you to the founding sponsor of the show, Illustration X. They've been there since day one. Wonderful illustration and animation agency representing a global portfolio of illustrators, animators, lettering specialists, live artists, fashion illustrators, you name it, they've got them, and you can see it at illustrationx.com. They're also a B Corp. They do a lot of great work for our industry, including being at the forefront of legislation protecting us from AI images, from bad contracts and bad clients, and they work with the SAA, the Society of Artists Agents, the AOI, the Association of Illustrators, all brilliant organisations, and they form a very valuable network for us independent freelance creatives. I hope you're well. The book turned up and it's all right. It's looking good. I'm very happy. I've found some typos, which kills me, and it kills any author, but it's kind of inevitable. It's 115,000 words, this book. It's a beast. It's a bumper size. And, I found them in Stephen King books. I found them in classics. I find them all the time in other books. And you just can't rat them all out in a book of that size, I don't think. If you have, well done. I haven't. But it's good. I'm being a perfectionist. I'm very happy with it. Lovely colours. Everything's come out as expected print-wise. Everything's nicely designed and typeset by my lovely wife, Laura. I'm very happy. the first wave are going out this week, and I hope you're going to start receiving them. So I'd love to see some pictures and get some feedback and all that stuff. So big thank you on that front. I also want to give a shout out to my latest sponsor. I brought them on board because I wanted to support the great work they were doing off the back of the wonderful interview I did with Olya Protasova, incredibly brave Ukrainian design activist, illustrator, designer, doing so much good work to bring Ukrainian culture and creativity to our doorsteps here in other countries. And it's one way that us lot in the creative industries can really support them. So go and take a look at the Ukrainian Institute. They're a brilliant organisation, and they curate various shows and projects of Ukrainian talent, working incredibly bravely through horrible times of war. And that's what that episode was about with Olya. Very uplifting, not uplifting, wrong word, challenging episode, but uplifting in terms of the sheer spirit that Olya showed us. And I followed it up with an episode called The Hockney Soldier, which was a short story I wrote in response to how horrible it felt to see a collection of design and art books that had been sold to a bookstore in Kiev by a person who we can only assume was a designer or an artist who had to go to fight in war. And it's beyond belief, it's beyond our comprehension here if you don't live in a country that's threatened by war. And I wrote a short story about it. So off the back of those two episodes, I am plugging the Ukrainian Institute, and I would love it if you could go and take a look at ui.org.ua and see what they're up to. Fantastic work, well worth supporting. So if you've got a podcast, if you have a blog, if you just want to share some stuff on social media, please do fire away, because the people in Ukraine have been so great, so grateful about these last couple of episodes, and they were challenging for me to put together on this podcast. They were heartfelt. It was quite traumatic to hear the stories and to see what those guys are going through. But when we're looking at that from the outside looking in, I think it's the least we can do to support. Anyway, there we are. Let's get into today's episode. So this is something completely wild, completely out there, but actually when it landed on my desk, I looked at, the angle of this potential podcast and just thought, okay, yeah, all right, I'll jump in. Let's make it work. So here's the lowdown. It's with Negin Farsad, who I mentioned at the top of the show, is an acclaimed Iranian-American writer and comedian and director and actor. And she went to a psychedelic retreat in Jamaica. And at first, you sort of think, what the hell? And it was for a piece in a Far magazine. In fact, here we go. I'm going to read you the sort of project outline. It's better than me waffling on. We'll talk about why this appealed. An increasing number of curious wellness seekers are turning to psychedelics for mental health, mindfulness and creativity. These substances, when harnessed carefully and correctly, can be a powerful tool to help open minds, shift perspectives and inspire new ways of thinking. Negin Farsad is an acclaimed Iranian-American writer, comedian, director and actor known for her unique blend of comedy and public advocacy. She's gained recognition for her creative and humorous approach to tackling complex social issues. This time around, she decided to take a look at herself. Negin visited Myco-Meditations in Jamaica, an assignment for Afar, to document a therapeutic psilocybin, so-called magic mushroom, retreat in detail. Her hilarious, touching and thoughtful article is available online now, and here's an excerpt. That first night, I kept asking the therapists about the trips they had witnessed and the outcomes they had seen. They told me about people who had successfully battled anxiety, suicidal ideation and depression. But essentially, said the delightful retreat therapist, Ades Greenidge, mushrooms are about getting over your horseshit so you can move on with your life. The cynic in me loved this explanation. Simple, elegant, filthy, getting over your horseshit. This moment hit me like a ton of bricks. Sure, I was there on assignment. Sure, I was looking for interesting tidbits and jokes. But I was definitely mired in mental horseshit. And my God, did I want to get over it. Most of my problems were me. They were voices in my head. They were the horseshit I was feeding myself. Maybe this was a gig, but one with a side of deep emotional repair. Accompanying Negin, as he did on a psychedelic journey, would be Justin Townsend, CEO and head facilitator of Myco-Meditations, the longest-running legal psilocybin retreat in Jamaica. With his experience in the business of psychedelic retreats, along with his grounding Jungian depth psychology and expertise in meditation and breathwork, Justin can provide some much needed context and creative insights of his own. So it's amazing stuff, and I wanted to do this because it was so far out of my comfort zone. And as Negin describes herself as something as a drug square, I am very much that. Maybe done a little bit too much boozing over the years, but that's about where it ends for me. So I was curious because I've heard a lot of well-positioned friends, very smart friends, very creative people, bigging up psilocybin and the way it connects you with the land and with your innermost self in a way that therapy cannot. And that's something that Justin is going to let us into from the scientific perspective. And Negin's going to recount her experience, and she's bloody hilarious, as you would hope from a comedian. So that's enough of an overview. I hope you find this interesting, because the whole Jungian depth psychology is something that I have touched upon in the Creative Condition book, and it's something that I find really fascinating, and it's about confronting the unconscious and those learned behaviours or deep-rooted automatic behaviours that we don't ever really question and can hold us back in life, can give us trouble. So I'm very excited to see what you guys make of it and see if it lands in the same way that it did for me. I think it's very exciting. I think these two are wonderful, and I hope coming out the other end you're as curious and interested as I am. I mean, I'm not going to be getting off to the retreat anytime soon. I don't think I could afford it. So we'll cross that bridge in later life, I'm sure, but it's just very interesting, and some of the stuff around creativity and the things that we're harbouring and carrying the baggage, very, very intriguing. So I hope you enjoy it. A big thank you again to the sponsor, Illustration X. You can check out their global range of illustrator and animator portfolios now at illustrationx.com. Enjoy the episode, guys. Keep in touch regarding the book. Kickstarters, I'll be on to you. Pre-order link coming up, hopefully, this week. Nice one. Enjoy this conversation with Negin Farsad and Justin Townsend.
This is Negin and I's first time together since she left the retreat.
Yeah.
One-on-one.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Quite the honour. I imagined that'd be like a long list of, yeah. Well, first of all, Justin, I'd love to start with you and just have a little chat about your role today. And, I'm interested in your motivation for starting micro meditations.
Sure. I've had two very distinct and separate paths in life. The more visible one, the last 25 years, has been in the corporate world. I was pretty good at that. But the older I got, it was trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. I became more sensitive with age and a bunch of other stuff. And then going back to my teens, experimented with mushrooms, terrified myself a few times in the process. Fast forward, I had my first ayahuasca experience in about the year 2000, and that's when I got involved with psychedelics as part of the psychedelic underground in Europe. So we're flying medicine men and medicine women in and pairing them up with clinicians. And that was but you wouldn't have found that on my LinkedIn profile until 2017-18, when these two paths converged. And my goal here was to create a Western contemporary therapeutic model using psilocybin at its core, where we do group therapy as well. There are 3 dosing sessions throughout the week over 7 days, and to do that in a very naturalistic environment. So Jamaica is one of the few places in the world where we can do this legally, and that's what we've done with micro meditations. But coming to the US as we speak, state by state, the FDA will be rescheduling MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy, and then psilocybin, which is the magic mushroom, over the course of the next 2 years. And it's beginning to happen across Europe, and at least the talk about it is happening in the UK as well, but it may take a little bit longer there.
Yeah, it really feels like there's a psychological shift in that regard at the moment. Even just, like I said, immediate conversations that are appearing on my radar just seems to be, I don't know if awakening is too strong of a word, but it feels like that.
It's a renaissance. Yes.
Yeah.
Awakening and a renaissance. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for good reason, for very good reason. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Negin, likewise, I'd love to just have a little insight into. I know you're a comedian and a writer, and you seem like there's a whole bag of talents going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a comedian, a writer, filmmaker, and part of the reason that the magazine specifically reached out to me is because they wanted someone that wasn't gonna be someone that would just be probably more skeptical, just have like, be, there's plenty of people that are already really into this. And then there's people like me had never done it before. And I knew very little about it. And, I'm also like, I'm not into self-care. I'm not into wellness. You know what I mean? Like all of those things I find cringy. And oftentimes, the mushroom world kind of falls into that kind of wellness, self-care world, which is funny because now having experienced it, I personally categorize it more in like a therapy world that's a little bit more data based. And, so that was kind of like my feeling about it coming out of it. And certainly there's like, the woo woo cringy stuff. And, I did witness people chanting during their trips, and connecting to their third eyes or whatever that happens. But also, I just feel like I saw a lot of just straight up therapy happen. So, so that's my kind of where I was starting from.
Yeah. And how long have you been a comedian for?
God, yeah. I started out as a policy advisor for the city of New York. I was a serious politician type person, like going into politics. But I was always doing comedy at night, doing stand up, and around the late 2000s, I sort of made the leap to be full time in comedy. And that was, it was a tough transition, but then eventually, stuck at it. I wouldn't be weeded out of the business, started making movies and doing acting jobs and obviously stand up. And so, and then I wrote a book, which ended up kind of making its rounds around, with some, magazine editors.
Awesome. Yeah, it's it's a slight segue question, but the reason I wanted to dig into the comedy a little bit more is that I've always had this thing in my life where I would always put the story ahead of, getting a good anecdote ahead of most things within reason, including
Oh yeah.
myself. So it's kind of when such an assignment, so this was a Far magazine, is it
Yeah,
termed as a magazine,
that's
landed
right.
on your lap. I'd love to just talk to you about your initial feelings when this brief landed.
Oh, immediately I was like, oh, this could be good material. It definitely, I operate in the same way. Like I'll do something if I think that there could be some material in it. It was like, I think there's something about comedians, like I'm not going to get on like I'm not going to go skydiving. Like I'm not like adventurous in that way, but I'll like go hang out with, a white supremacist and see what happens. You know what I mean? Like I'm adventurous in a way of like, what is the story? Can I meet, who am I going to meet? Like, are they going to be interesting? And I knew, that I was going to be around a lot of really interesting people, that the experience itself was going to be noteworthy for me as someone who's pretty much a drug square. Like I tried to get serious about weed for a minute because I was like going through a bad breakup. Yeah, that's a great idea. Like I watched YouTube videos on how to properly roll a joint. Like I was really like, I was trying to do, and then I started to like, I would smoke some weed and then I'd be like, oh, this is great. Like it stops the tears. Like I'm feeling good. And then the next day I would like forget to do the weed. You know what I mean? And then I'd be like, how do people do this? Like, do you set an alarm to like remind yourself to like do weed? Like, how do you become a proper pothead? I can't seem to get it done. And so that never really worked for me. And I don't drink, I don't do anything else. So to come at it from like a pretty much of a squares perspective, I think felt like, oh, there's like a lot here that could happen, that I could be changed, I could meet people who can change me or my perspective. So so that kind of it felt titillating and thrilling, definitely, when I got the assignment.
Yeah. Well, so what I thought could be quite a fun/funny starting point, given what you've just described there, and given Justin's position as an expert in this world of psychedelics, I wanted to start with some of the basic definitions that we're going to discuss today, and I'd love to hear your take on both of them, which I think will be quite cool. So if you don't mind, Justin, psychedelic. How are we describing psychedelic? I'd love to hear that from your expertise point of
Okay.
view.
The original, I think it was Greek or Latin, meant mind manifesting. So when you take psychedelics, two or three things happen. Something happens neurologically within the brain. It's been demonstrated through fluid MRIs and lots of research that's been happening in the US. They've identified in the brain a structure called the default mode network. This is where our sense of self resides. And when you take a therapeutic dose of psilocybin, default mode network comes offline temporarily while you're in the trip state. And the filters, many of our perceptual filters and our psychological filters and defenses are removed. Um, Most of us are habitually identified with our thoughts, right? We're either worrying about something in the future or we're seeing the now through the eyes of the past. And therefore, the present moment is very weighted down by the past and the future. So when we have our default mode network reset, all of the inner chatter and thoughts and negative self-talk and catastrophic thinking just goes away. The second thing that can happen is that most of us are very uncomfortable with our negative emotions. We tend to repress them or distract ourselves from them. But nevertheless, the body holds on to lots of them, especially if we've been through trauma. The body can hold on to the physiological and emotional responses to that trauma that can bring us down. And so psilocybin also has what are called reactive properties. And that means simply it can bring that to the surface that has the most emotional charge within you. Whether it was your father that died 20 years ago and you were numb and never grieved him, whether it's a trauma that you went through 20 or 30 years ago that's been repressed. And what psilocybin also does is it introduces cognitive plasticity to the brain and allows for the right hemisphere to come online a lot more than it typically does, allowing for more creative thinking. And certainly within the top 5 psychology or personality traits, the openness spectrum is at the high end of openness. It means that we are more at ease with ambiguity and uncertainty, and we have more creative thinking. At the other end of the openness spectrum, we can be very rigid in our thinking and very closed off and stay within our comfort zone. So it's been shown that also a therapeutic dose of psilocybin can increase your openness on the openness scale by 1 standard deviation compared to the population at large. And to give some context, personality trait work would typically take 10 to 15 years in a therapeutic environment just to arrive at that. So it's multifaceted, whether you have depression, anxiety, trauma, or just the difference between waking up on Monday morning and hitting the alarm 3 times versus leaping out of bed on a Monday morning with some vim and vigor. It can create very, very positive shifts across personality traits, across our psyche, our psychology, and also within our brain as well.
Wow. Yeah, that's really quite profound.
And can I just say that you just witnessed like a Professor Justin moment. He has like literally 10,000. He has like 10,000 moments like that a day. It's like remarkable, and I think it's like, for me, that's the kind of stuff I want to hear. I want to hear science. I want to hear data. He can also talk about like histories of various cultures vis-a-vis like default mode networks. It's like it's pretty remarkable. So like that is why the dude is the expert that he is like answers like that.
It's amazing, isn't it? I'm better than I ever was. As somebody who got a double F in science at school, I'm I mean, I blame it on the education system rather than, me being an idiot. But it's
Of course.
but because I've been writing and researching creativity for the last 10 years, I'm slowly actually, I knew what the default mode network was, and I kind of went, get in. I knew that one. And so I'm slowly getting there. So then I guess to turn it on to you, Negin, like sort of where were you at on psychedelic? How would you define psychedelic prior to this experience?
Well, I mean, I mean, it just sounds like something from the 60s, right? Like it just sounded like people in the 60s wearing tie-dye, like in a forest and looking at trees and being like, oh, the tree's moving or whatever. Like that is how I would have defined psychedelic. And it's so interesting, like, how, in 2024, that definition seems, obviously it's so antiquated. One thing I'll say about the default mode network, which I had never heard of before, going on the retreat, is comedians have like a really, really strong, hardcore, I would say generally evil default mode network. Like we just say garbage to ourselves all the time. And about 4 days or 5 days after the retreat, I was scheduled to perform at a place called Tanglewood in Massachusetts and in the United States. And it's about a 7,000 person venue. And I was on this show called Wait, Don't Tell Me. It's a very popular show in the United States. And normally in that show, it's a panel show. Like I'll offer up a joke, and then after I say the joke, I then berate myself for however many moments on like how terrible that joke was, right? Even if the audience laughed. And then after doing that show in front of 7,000 people, I would do a joke. And then after that joke, I would just listen to everybody else's jokes. Like I didn't have that time of hating myself. And it was wild. I was like, oh, I've never experienced this before. This is so much more fun than what I was doing. Like why that whole thing is extremely inefficient and counterproductive. Why do we all do that? So I feel like I really like after the retreat, like fully understood the power of the default mode network and what it does to our inner thinking.
Well, yeah, and even when you're aware of it, and even when you sort of start to do the groundwork of staying on top of it, I guess it's like Justin referenced that kind of a longer arc in in a therapeutic mode. And I think what you just described, Negin, is incredibly common for people who practice creativity in a professional environment because it's an extension of self. So we put ourselves out there, whether it's comedy, writing, art, music. I mean, I guess, of course, it matters within the nuances, but it's so common, and there are a lot of vulnerable, sensitive people. So this is really interesting that's something that we might suddenly have quietened because that could make such a difference. And I mean, your case in point there, it does. So Justin, I mean, I'd love to hear, is this something that I don't know what my question is here, but is this something how long have you been aware of that particular, property?
In about 2010, 2012, Johns Hopkins, the big research institute, very pedigreed, very elite in the US, identified the default mode network. There had been some earlier research about that, so I really got to grips with this in about 2010. But what their original findings were that they actually misstated. They said when you take psychedelics, the brain lights up like a Christmas tree. Actually, the opposite is true. Psychedelics are probably one of the safest models we have for replicating what happens to the brain in the early stages of the dying process. The brain activity starts to wear off and go down, and filters are removed. So, and a lot more starts to happen. A lot more can emerge from within us. I think it's safe to say that we have our conscious mind and we have our unconscious mind, and it's like an iceberg, with the 10% above the water being the conscious mind and the 90% below the water being the unconscious. And so just going back to early childhood, depending upon how you were parented and what your life experiences were, we all have a habit of developing negative narratives about ourselves, right? Which is part of what the default mode network, per Negin's example, is busy replicating and reinforcing and telling us about. So, but there is a permeable barrier between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, and highly creative people tend to have a more permeable barrier. Hence, intuitive insight can come up. Their right hemisphere is more active, and the right hemisphere is more responsible for seeing the whole thing and image and symbol and meaning, whereas the left hemisphere of the brain more likes to categorize and label, and we tend to get lost in the weeds. So certainly we see that on retreat, even people that wouldn't deem themselves creative, when they take psychedelics, this permeable barrier becomes more permeable. They'll start to dream more, flashes of inspiration. So you can come at this from many different directions within the psyche and the brain, but the default mode network is a very, very interesting structure within the brain where we are self-referencing. And interestingly, it's only if we are focused upon a task, it's generally not that active, which is why when you're laying in bed at night, covers up to the chin, trying to sleep, no task engaged, the brain can be full of all sorts of innate chatter and dialogue, right? When you're focused on a task, it's less engaged. And so one of the goals of psychedelics when we reset the default mode network temporarily is to relax all of that and take it offline. Now, once you've finished with your psychedelic session, you may identify that you have maladaptive behaviors in the world. You may identify that you've got these narratives about yourself that are negative and where they came from. So once you finish your psychedelic retreat, you can go back out into the world and develop healthier new behaviors, create new neural pathways, and that will keep the negative inner chatter somewhat at bay as well, as it gets replaced by more a broader perspective and more positive, healthier ways of being.
Mm. Is there a crossover with autotelic states and flow states within this?
Absolutely, there is. Absolutely, there is. I mean, I would question my own ability to stand on a stage in front of 7,000 people at Tanglewood. I've sat once there in the audience. That was for John Cougar Mellencamp. Actually, it's a lovely location and venue. But yeah, being in the flow state, there is research. I mean, athletes are working with psychedelics now to optimize their athletic performance. It's not just people with mental health issues. Across the board, it's having many, many positive impacts on people, how they see themselves and how they navigate the world. And then being in that flow state is definitely key as well. There are degrees of the flow state. But what Negin mentioned about going out on stage and wondering if a joke is going to bomb is no different from the writer launching that book, from the painter having their gallery exhibition, to the corporate product manager launching that new product on a Monday, right? That sense of dread and how it's going to be received. A lot of the irrational thinking tends to be just put to one side and go away.
Which is incredibly valuable and hard to come by, I guess. So yeah, that's an amazing upside. And really interesting actually on the athlete front. You know, again, it's not that's what I love to hear are stories like that that really kind of smash that preconception that Negin alluded to with the psychedelic thing. And I would have echoed exactly the way she described it. I would have thought Beatles, Yellow Submarine, and thinking of, you know, John Lennon sat next to Maharishi and all that stuff. And I'm sure that was amazing too. But these kind of stereotypical preconceptions, I guess, is the reason that there's a bigger barrier in front of people being curious and embracing psychedelics than there is something like alcohol, which I would hazard a guess is incredibly more damaging mentally and physically.
Absolutely. There was a book released, I think, in 2017 by Michael Pollan called How to Change Your Mind, which was all about the psychedelic experience. And that began really a sea change in people's thinking in the US. But like most things, Europe catches up 5 to 10 years later, or begins a process of catching up with the US 5 to 10 years later. But it's been, I mean, look, most of our guests are psychedelically naive. Nobody's rocking up down here with dreads and tie-dye t-shirts and dream catcher earrings. We are, but let me say that we are science, evidence, and research based. The majority of the team member are licensed therapists or psychologists. But what you can never know or tell is what is going to emerge out of a guest's psyche on retreat. And it may be the most material reductionist scientist that's very cerebral, could have been the guy that Negin heard chanting, or the guy she saw bowing down and just holding onto the earth, or the woman that was doing something similar. So once we take the psychedelics, we do become a little bit disinhibited. There has to be a lot of good supervision. But we see that people go through catharsis as trauma is released and repressed emotions let go of. They can get cognitive insights. I'll give you an example. There's a very good book written back in the 60s or 70s by a psychedelic therapist in the US called The Secret Chief. And he said, imagine that you're on the middle of a circular stage, you're sat in a chair, you haven't taken the medicine yet, but around you is a big red curtain, like at the movie theaters. And there's a gap in that curtain that's 3 foot wide. That 3 foot width represents all your truth and knowledge about yourself and about the world. You take the medicine, and slowly the curtain draws all the way back and shows you all the truth and all the knowledge about yourself and the world. But the good thing is once the medicine is leaving your body and that curtain starts to draw back around you again, this time it remains at 10 foot wide, not 3 foot wide. So with that enhanced understanding of yourself and why you are the way you are, and if you do have maladaptive behaviors, how they originally began in childhood, maybe, you can, with this expanded understanding of yourself, you can then make better and different decisions. The other mediator is the emotional breakthroughs that we've talked about. The third interesting piece is what's called the mystical experience. On a therapeutic dose of psilocybin, the ego completely dissolves for a while, becomes unbounded, and there could be a great sense of connectedness that isn't just what you're visually seeing on the mentation of your visual scape in front of you, but what you're feeling in your body as well. And whether you're religious or spiritual or not, nobody is immune to having a mystical experience. But when you have one, it could pretty much change everything about how you see the world and navigate the world. And at the end of the day, the scientists and research don't fully understand the mystical experience. But what we do know, having measured it, is that if you have a mystical experience, the long-term psychological outcomes are that much better because of it. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening in the hard question of consciousness as well.
You leave me lost for words sometimes. But, Negin, I'd love to, in your article, which is fantastic, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm going to get that out to the listeners. But you hit upon guilt as being a particularly prominent aspect of this trip for you. Love to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a mom, and that, being a comedian and a mom at the same time is like a real great guilt stew, because I'm on the road a lot. I have to leave her a lot. And so my first trip was really all about that guilt. And I think it's also interesting because I think in all of my trips, I was like carrying around a thing that was very heavy, and counterproductive to just me advancing in life. You know what I mean? And so guilt was a really big one, and it had made me extremely tired. Just this guilt feeling, and I kind of went into my trip. My daughter was holding my hand, and she would say, don't go on safari. And I would be like, no, I have to go on safari. Of course, safari was a stand-in for comedy, which I do think is hilarious, because in both cases you can be eaten by a wild animal. But if you're not, it's a really fascinating, wonderful experience. It's like I had to constantly like leave her in this trip and tell her that it's okay. And my mom became my daughter. My daughter became my mom. I have guilt because my mom never got to accomplish her dreams because she had a kid, and she's from a patriarchal, whatever, society. And I just had I was carrying around so much guilt that I just realized that I was so tired and that I deserved rest. And so like one of my big realizations from that first trip, which I would write, I would like grip a notebook, and they make you, when you're doing these trips, they actually make you wear or they ask you to wear an eye mask, so you're not like focusing on a tree, you're like really going inward, you go inside. And it's funny because you are in this beautiful backdrop of Jamaica, but like you are going inside. And I was like, always I would write down my little realizations. And, one of the first ones after like realizing what a tiring sensation guilt is that everyone deserves a nap. So like I would lift up my mask and write in like 55-point font, because that's how well you can write when you're tripping, like everyone deserves a nap. And in like, by the way, serial killer handwriting, it looked crazy. And I remember, the other interesting thing for me was how difficult some of these trips were, because I think, again, because you're thinking of, John Lennon and a mystical forest or whatever, you're not actually understanding that some of these trips can be really challenging, because if you're trying to like slay your dragons, I think as Justin actually said it in one of our meetings, if you're trying to slay your dragons, that might not be like a fun, cute experience. You know what I mean? It's going to be difficult. And so I spent the first trip almost entirely just sobbing. Like I cried the entire time, more than I've cried. I cried a lifetime's worth of crying in one trip session. And I came out of it. One of the nurses walked me back to my room because you can't really like super walk on your own after one of these experiences. And I took a look in the mirror and I was like, oh my God, my eyes are so puffy. And she was like, yeah, you cried a considerable amount. So it was just like, and but it was also didn't phase anyone because they've seen all sorts of experiences like that. And also like, kept reminding me this wasn't a bad trip so much as it was a challenging one, like because you needed to deal with something, and dealing with something can be challenging, and guilt for me was like a really big one. And the other, I think, really funny thing for me about the realizations that you have when you're doing this is that for me they're all, I've been in therapy. I've known that guilt is silly. I've known that I know that I'm a pretty workaholic type person, that I need rest, right? Like some people, therapists have told me that. I know rationally those things are true, but there was something about the experience of the mushrooms that makes you not just rationally understand that to be true, but physically embody the truth of those things. So what's funny is a lot of the realizations, like I say in the article, are just like captions underneath a cute kitten poster. Like they're so basic, right? Like you deserve a nap, like you deserve rest, like you can do anything you want. Like all of those realizations, they're literally embroidered on throw pillows around the country. And yet, so you read them, you see them, these truths, but you don't feel them. And I never felt them until the mushrooms.
Yeah, and it's, I guess it's that disconnect that Justin touched upon. It's that there's a vast difference between the theoretical understanding of something you need to deal with, in your
Right.
terms, horse shit you need to clear. I love that, by the way. And actually feeling that and knowing it and getting in touch with that. Justin, I'd love to ask. So I as part of the research for this, I went and watched a documentary called Fabulous. Are we saying fungi or fungi, by the way? I don't know which one's right.
I've heard both. I just say fungi though.
All right, we'll go with, I'll say fungi then, 'cause that's what comes naturally to me. But
Yeah.
and what was incredible about this was just this idea that we over time have evolved from fungi. That as organisms, as human beings, that we are, we are one and the same in that regard. So it would make absolute sense when you think about the fact that when we consume this stuff, that we tap into like mycelium networks, that it is going to bring us inside and touch upon something. And one of the most interesting parts that I found from that was the description that I heard where you see sound and you hear, what's the term? I've got it. I've got a note here.
Synesthesia. There are different types of synesthesia. I've actually had people down here that already had, what was it called? Chromatic synesthesia, that saw letters of the alphabet consistently in different colors, and then you can have it with music, where you become the music when you're having a mushroom trip, and you don't know where you stop and the music begins. So synesthesia happening as part of the mushroom experience is definitely there as well. I don't know what, if any, mental health benefits it would confer upon you, but it's certainly an interesting part of the experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I reference it is it's that idea of going inside yourself and actually feeling those dragons, or all those ideas, all the good things, and actually, I do think sometimes, as humans, we can be slightly arrogant in the sense that we are still great apes. We're smarter than chimpanzees,
Yeah.
but we are still great apes. And to think that we know everything and we know all of the realms around us, does that make any sense? That I feel like if anything was going to give us that connection to something a little broader than what we know in the physical here and now, then it would be this. It would be fungi. Is there any sense in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's interesting to me is I think that the first mushrooms, I'm going to say non-psychedelic mushrooms, I think came around about 2 billion years ago. And my understanding is that psilocybin mushrooms about 600 million years ago. And if you look at the molecule, the psilocybin molecule, it is very, very close to the serotonin molecule. And so we have serotonin receptors in our brain, and the only key that typically fits that lock is a serotonin in the serotonin receptor. But interestingly, psilocybin is a perfect fit for that lock as well. And then it unlocks all of this potential. So how that's evolved over time is very interesting. And the impact that, there's the stoned ape theory, which came out of Terence McKenna, the bard of the psychedelic world since the 70s, that says that we came down out of the trees, began to follow cattle. We ate the mushrooms out of their cowpats, some of which would have been liberty caps or psilocybin. And in doing so, this helped the brain develop more and eventually the frontal cortex to come along. It gave us insights that we otherwise wouldn't have had. Alongside, of course, our ability to cook meat and get more calories out of it and therefore grow the brain. There's lots of interesting intersectionality there.
Wow. And again, so with the whole guilt thing, were you aware prior to this of any adverse impacts upon your creativity, your flow, your ability to generate ideas?
I would say, like, I generally felt like I was kind of in some sort of a transition, like a, not necessarily like a full rut, but like rut adjacent. And that was also like the serendipitous thing about getting the assignment was that I had been feeling like, what can I do to shake myself out of this rut feeling, and this, that experience felt, like targeted to me, and for that reason. And I think one of the things that happened was, I had a really traumatic childbirth experience, and one of the therapists there pulled me aside, and I had mentioned it sort of like in passing, but like, not very seriously. And she pulled me aside and said, "Did you have a traumatic childbirth?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And she was like, "Oh, you might still be dealing with that trauma. It usually takes 4 to 6 years my kid is 5. She was 4 at the time. It takes 4 to 6 years to recover." And I was like, "Oh, no. I have 15 minutes of stand up on that birth. So like, don't worry. I'm good. I figured it out. Those 15 minutes are tight. So no, I'm fine." But of course, in my last trip there, I literally had to re-experience the birth of my child, which was extremely painful. And one of the reasons it was painful is I didn't have an epidural for 17 hours, and and they were sort of like medically torturing me with various medieval devices to try and get my cervix to open. So I was very, very much in pain, and I said out loud, Can someone just give me the epidural, And the therapist came over and she said, "Oh, you know what? The nurse is right here. Why don't you ask her to give you the epidural?" So she basically played into the scene and helped me rewrite that experience from being something that was like so horrible to me just asking for what I needed and for the pain to stop. And it's funny because that actually, Justin was talking about people like releasing a trauma and then experiencing some kind of elation. That was exactly my experience, because I like asked for the epidural, whatever, and then I was kind of like released of that delivery room, and I had like a really just light and airy sensation, and it was like for like 3 hours I was in just an utter state of happiness, and I think it's because you carry these things around at a subconscious level, and what are they doing? Are they hindering your creativity? Possibly. Are they just hindering your general sense of well-being, your well-being as a parent, your well-being as a friend, as a daughter, as a sister? all of those things are possible. You don't really, it's hard to say like what that trauma was doing to me on a daily basis. I think in general, it was probably giving me a lot of just like anxiety. And I was able to sort of like get rid of it in that moment. And it really was, I really do feel like I walk around without that anymore. And I do, and there was something that was always needling at me about that childbirth that I got to kind of lose.
That's really beautiful to hear, actually. And Justin, I guess that goes back to what you said about the kind of acceleration through psychedelics that might otherwise take a hell of a long time through therapy. Would that be accurate?
And most of our guests that come to us, well, many of them have been in therapy, but they found they can only go so far with this top-down cognitive talk therapy. And so when you take psilocybin and the default mode network goes offline, our defenses drop on their own, and then the material will start to arise. But I think what's important to understand is that, I'm a Brit, you're a Brit. I don't know how many of your listeners are a Brit. Within our culture, there's the concept of the stiff upper lip, right? And not too overt with demonstrating our emotions. Now, there's a great philosophy called Stoicism. When you're in the healthy middle of that, it's a good place to be. You're not wallowing in your own self-misery and self-pity. And I think a lot of Brits think, well, if I take psychedelics, I'm going to get all miserable and upset and cry a lot. And yes, that may happen. But at the far end of the unhealthy spectrum on Stoicism, if you're sad or angry and you keep on repressing that and you don't allow yourself to feel it and process it, what's going to happen is you're going to build up a weight of repressed emotion over years of anger, sadness, grief, anxiety, whatever's going on, shame, guilt. And ultimately, the more you repress, it will lead to a lot less emotional capacity later in life and quite a rigid worldview. So with psychedelics, the ability to feel all of these emotions, to go through catharsis, and that the Greek interpretation of emotion and catharsis is that which passes through. Allow yourself to feel it and rid yourself of it. You feel a lot lighter afterwards and a lot less burdened in so many different ways. So anybody that's from a particularly repressed family background, it's just habituated. It's how they are. Maybe the parents modeled that as well, right? The culture supports it. They might shy away from the sensitivity around emotion, but when our emotions are not in balance and heavily repressed, generally mental health issues and even physical conditions can arise out of that as well. So releasing all of it is absolutely key. And generally, you don't end up stuck wallowing in your own self-misery and pity. It's out. You come back to the healthy middle ground again.
And is that getting into kind of Jungian depth psychology? Because I touched upon this in my own book that I've got coming out in a few weeks, and the reason I did because I was very fortunate. So when I was around 14 years old, so from a grounding of quite openness within the home, like my mum is completely open, so I had that. My dad is he's very much that stoic Yorkshireman, old school Yorkshireman.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Yeah.
more the stiff upper lip type thing. I'm very thankful of the balance I had there. But what happened was I met a bunch of friends around 14 who are still my closest friends to this day. And we were just incredibly open. And from a school background that I'm sure both of you can probably relate to, a wild guess, where you kind of fit in. You don't want to stand out too much. You don't want to put your neck on the line. Meeting these guys, they were very open with everything, whether it was romantic heartbreak, whether it was anything, physical traits, personal flaws, whatever. It was, we were all open, we were very close, and we celebrated those traits. What that gave me was this ability to use those traits in my own creativity. And I'm 40 years old, no, 41. Shit, I'm 41. And now, to this day, at 41, it's still the bedrock of my biggest and best ideas within my own creative practice. I'm aware that that's very Jung. Is it Jungian?
Jungian, yeah, Jungian.
Jungian. There you go. Sorry, Yorkshire.
Yeah, that's okay. There's an interesting statement from Jung that I think really encapsulates a lot of some of his work. So I talked about the unconscious mind and how it holds all of our shame, our guilt, our narratives that we developed in childhood, our beliefs about ourselves. That's called the shadow aspect of the personality. And you can see that as being all the things about yourself that you don't want to admit to, most of which you don't know, some of which you maybe do or have an inkling of. Well, what Jung said is that if you don't make the unconscious, as in these childhood patterns, conscious, if you don't make yourself aware of them and bring them into the light of consciousness, they will play themselves out in the world around you, and you will call it your fate. And so let me contextualize that. I may have a female, 50 years old, high functioning, show up down here as a guest with some background depression and, say, a poor relationship with alcohol, and maybe cycling through poor romantic relationships. Okay. She may have an experience on the retreat week where she starts to recall heretofore buried childhood trauma. That the psyche, when the trauma happened, the psyche can go into what's called dissociative amnesia and hide that memory from you, and the body holds on to the score. So if she will now begin to recall this memory, process all of the feelings around that trauma, be it disgust, shame, guilt, contamination, fear, when that's all out, and she recognizes her maladaptive behaviors and how she will understand, that's why I'm depressed. That's why I have this poor relationship with alcohol. And I keep cycling through abusive relationships because I was abused 30 years ago. There's something going on here. So until you make the unconscious conscious, it will play itself out in the world around you, and you will think it's your fate. So psychedelics are very good at taking this unconscious material and presenting you with it. And when you're presented with it, you can then begin to therapeutically integrate it, and life gets better as a result after that as well.
It's, I think it's so sad when you see it happening, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure I'm as guilty as the next person, but you see it in the people you meet and the reasons that they tell themselves that they can't do that thing, to put it within the realm of creativity, whether it's start to write that book or, work, I guess in your world, Negin, to start to, go out there and perform a stand-up set. That's an incredibly intimidating thing in its own right, without any of that stuff playing out in the background.
Yeah. It's a terrible job. I don't recommend it to anyone. But yeah, I mean, I think it's so interesting, like how difficult it is for us to see those things and confront those things. Especially like for people like me, I'm in comedy. I'm around a lot of artists. Like we are, more intuitive. We're like really observant. A lot of what we do is literally just observing, trying to figure out the feelings of other people, and then encapsulating them into jokes, and then spitting them out on stages. So it's funny how much we're able to see in others and how little we're able to see in ourselves.
Very much so. And I guess that's why therapy is so prominent in the world, and so, and why psychedelics, as Justin's proven today, is just, is something that it sounds like we need a lot more of in our society, or, more understanding and more embracing of that. Justin, you mentioned that this, is legal in Jamaica. And you mentioned that there might be breakthroughs elsewhere. Where are we at in terms of that battle to see this as, proper science, proper therapy that is going to help people, as opposed to some wacky shit?
The science has been happening. Well, the science began in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Then came the war on drugs, and the whole thing got shut down, right? It was reactivated again in the US about maybe 15 years ago. Very, very limited research. A lot of very preeminent scientists risked their career or to apply for grants that weren't readily available to study psychedelics. So with the advent of neuroscience and neuroimaging now compared to the 60s and 70s, we understand a lot more. So many major research institutes are testing psychedelics for depression, anxiety, especially end-of-life anxiety. We've been given a terminal diagnosis. We treat a lot of people with terminal diagnosis down here for trauma, for PTSD, for fibromyalgia, for alcohol use disorder, and other addictions. The FDA, as I mentioned earlier, is going to approve MDMA/ecstasy, primarily initially for treatment-resistant PTSD. It's a limited use model that will eventually turn into treatment for other mental health conditions. Psilocybin is going to follow on an FDA national level, roughly a year to two after that. Meanwhile, Oregon in the US has legalized psilocybin, and Colorado has legalized psilocybin. And a number of other states, from New Jersey to Massachusetts and others, are all in the process of either researching, decriminalizing, or legalizing. Um, in Holland, the Netherlands, I've been told it's called, not Holland. In the Netherlands, psilocybin is available in truffle form. It's not allowed to use mushroom form of psilocybin, just the truffle form. So there are a number of retreat centers in Holland. I think in the UK, I think what you're going to see is more. I doubt you're going to see retreat centers like ours. Okay. I think you're going to see much more of a strict medical model as it's rolled out into existing medical infrastructure. I question the viability of that because the medical model, which psychiatrist or MD or psychologist is used to spending 6 to 8 hours with a patient while they're going through such an experience? Okay. Normally it's 15 minutes in, write the script, show them the door, and they're on their way to the chemist to get their SSRIs and antidepressant medication. So it remains to be seen. We don't have the typical patient doctor power differential here. We have relationships of, if you like, mutual, equality. Okay. So we don't have any airs or graces. We don't take ourselves too seriously, and yet all of our therapists are licensed. And so I think the medical model, it remains to be seen. It's going to have some efficacy, but I will question whether psychiatrists and white coats are the right people to be delivering this kind of experience to people.
But it's also, it is really exciting to see, like, on a larger scale, what could happen. I mean, when I was at the retreat, just so happened there was an article that came out. I think it was Justin actually talked to us about it. It was maybe in the BBC or something, about a literal, I think it was a white supremacist who did mushrooms and then was no longer a white supremacist. He's like, oh, that was like stupid. I took mushrooms, like, I realized that that is so stupid. And I actually was like, yeah, I mean, there was a guy, at our retreat who was very closed off, like could not share emotion or like any detail about himself or his life at all whatsoever. And I remember on the 4th day or something, he was like, oh, hey, Negin, can I help you with that? Like, he was, which sounds minor, but for this guy, it was almost like he was bearing his soul, like just to do something like cute and kind for someone. And I was like, dude, like, I was looking at this guy like, oh my God, what's going on? He's opened up so much. And so you sort of see people, who really need it, like, need to be able to open up and to be able to be less like angry and stuff like that on a just larger social level. That could be great, especially for how polarized we are right now, and how tense everything is. Like, if there could be, if some changes could happen to scale with psilocybin, I mean, I think it would be remarkable.
I absolutely agree, and that's something I wanted to touch upon actually in the game, because I'm a huge believer in the power of creativity, the arts, in kind of in turning these tides. And it doesn't have to be overt. It doesn't have to be big old singing, dancing, obvious campaigns. It doesn't have to be overt. And I think that through articles and experiences like this, you can really be a part of a sea change, of something quite profound, by just doing your job and doing, and going there, having the experience, delivering the goods for such an article. Is that something you'd agree with? Do you think that can have a ripple effect beyond that? Because I certainly do when it comes to creativity. I think that these small things affect big change in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I love the idea that like this is like work. Like, I clock in, I clock out, just like my parents did, doing 14-hour days. I'm out there in Jamaica just doing psilocybin like a good hard worker, putting in the time, slaving away. But yeah, but it was, I do feel like it, and just even on just such a small level of like having published published this article, so many people have reached out to me to be like, oh my God, I think I need to do this, you know? And because I think especially now we're sort of like all in our silos where there's not as much human interaction as there needs to be. There's just not enough like release and catharsis. And I do think, you know, just from the reactions I got from this piece, a lot of people being like, yeah, I feel like I'm carrying around a bunch of stuff and I would love to just get rid of it. And so if that describes you, you know, we're not supposed to be like human bags of trauma. Like that's not how this life is supposed to play out. If there's any way you can, you know, rid yourself of that so that you can like look forward and like have a lightness that is better for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just by, you know, and there's something wonderful about humor that I've just always adored. And there are countless quotes I could throw. I'm not going to start doing that about just, you know, that kind of people have you in the palm of your hand when you're angry or you come at them with a different response. But humor is a really powerful thing, and it's really beautiful to see in a long form article not only you going through personal vulnerabilities and putting yourself out there in that regard, you know, by the very writing of the article and talking about your own guilt. Now we're having this conversation. Who knows who's going to listen to that? Who knows who's going to read that article? But actually, when there's something as exciting as psilocybin and this acceptance that actually, you know, we could do a lot more with this. And like you said about that cracked me up, the white supremacist who's no longer a white supremacist. That's amazing. And I think that I always just do think that the artists have a big role to play in getting out there and doing their thing, you know.
Absolutely.
Justin, is that something that you think can, because you're obviously doing wonderful groundwork and being the expertise and being the therapists in this regard and having the retreat, you know, were you excited by this article and this idea that people like Negin can help to spread the word of this great work that you're doing?
Absolutely, and it happens on many levels. I mean, I've worked with a lot of fairly successful artists, sculptors, musicians, comedians, people that have played to an audience of 30 or 40,000, their household names. And then you get them inside the retreat environment, and then you see what they're like and how they're feeling and how they're performing after the retreat. It's incredible. So they are what I would call force multipliers, right? Because they have a platform and then they have a skill or an ability within their creativity that they're really, really good at. But I'd say on other levels as well. I mean, you know, we have a male that will come through here that was maybe retired recently, turning into a grumpy old man. He's not so connected to himself or his family or his adult children anymore, or his friends. And he will get a whole new lease on life. So when he goes home, those new attributes and qualities that he has with his and willingness to let his guard down and be honest with himself and honest with his wife and his adult children and friends, the ripple effect of that just goes on and on. It just brings out the best of people. And again, I mean, to Negin's point, there is so much polarization. We've got the culture wars going on. We're all sort of disconnected from ourselves and disconnected from each other more than ever. And yet what we get to see on retreat week in and week out is the best of humanity coming through, the kind of connectedness that exists between the people on retreat when they drop their guard, lower their defenses, put all their deep, dark secrets, as much as they're comfortable doing, into the group and sharing that. Then all on the same day at the same time, going into a therapeutic dosing experience and having the courage to do that and then to process these emotions and come out the other side. It's a powerful, powerful experience. But that social connectedness piece that we seem to have lost comes right back. And it's much better than it ever could have been. So these people are all force multipliers. And to give you some perspective, we've served over 2,000 guests, something like 6,000 doses of psilocybin. So we get to see this happen all the time. We do about 40 to 45 retreats every year. Each retreat is on average 12 people, no more. It's a 50-50 mix between male and female. The age ranges tend to be from early 20s through, we had one gentleman last week who's going to be 90 in 2 weeks. Okay, but the core of our guests tend to be in their mid to late 30s through their mid to late 70s. And it's just incredible to see what comes over them throughout the week. And then after they go home, how they continue to be as well.
And it was like really, in my experience, we were 9 perfect strangers, as the Hulu show suggests. And it was like the most, you know, I say in the article, it was like a casting director's dream, because it was like, you know, a sort of like woo woo yoga person you might expect to see, but there was also like a tech bro, there was like a gay pharmacist, there was like a, you know, fully practicing Hasidic Jew, there was a Muslim comedian that was me. So like it, like the mix of people was wild, you know? And so it is kind of like a microcosm of humanity. And then in that time, when you're like dealing with these 9 people, you start to become so connected to them and so concerned about them. Like I remember asking, you know, saying to Justin or one of the therapists, like, hey, can you like go and check on Jack? I just want to make sure Jack's doing okay. Like, and we were all doing that to each other. Like, can someone go check on Negin? Is Negin okay? Like, just why? It was just, we were all had just created this bond and like wanted to make sure that we were all good. And it was, it was really lovely. It is one of those things that's just incredibly uplifting, that you could care so much about someone you don't know at all.
I think it's something we've sadly, you know, I think we need it, but that community again in society. I don't think there's too many people who would deny that. I think it's, yeah, you could we sit here all day and look at the reasons why, but you spoke of it with the polarity and you know, so but it's totally natural. We're social creatures, and having looked at the research of all this, it's, you know, adverse mental and emotional and physical things happen when we don't have positive social relationships. So if we find these amazing, very natural ways of aiding and boosting that within that innate quality in the human condition, then you know, let's get it going, let's get it moving, let's get some politicians in there.
I would add as well that um, it gives you the opportunity to start to become and arrive at being unapologetically you in your best form. So, you know, integration therapy, part of what that means is to live an integrated life. So there's as little light as possible shining between how you seem to be with others, how you think you are, and then who you truly are on the inside. Now, of course, we need to have a certain amount of etiquette in the workplace, a certain amount of etiquette when we're amongst strangers, perhaps. But a lot of these false facades and personas are put out there, and it takes a lot of courage and humility just to try and attempt to be unapologetically you. And what you will find is that when you do become unapologetically you, some people will self-select themselves out of your life, and that will make room for much more valuable relationships to come in and for people to accept you just as you are, good and bad. So that becoming more authentic is certainly a path that a lot of our guests take as well. And when they do, it's a lot less exhausting and draining for them to be as well.
And I would also say that is the bedrock. That's optimal creativity right there. When you reach that place, that's when the bullshit stops and you can really start to point that truest self forward, and it's an amazing feeling when that happens. I think it's just a really exciting thing for someone who's a complete novice who has never done this myself. I'm much where you were, Negin, in terms of prior to your retreat, and yet this makes absolute sense. So that's exciting. That must kind of be thrilling to you, Justin.
Oh, it is. It is. It's thrilling to be pioneering at the forefront of this renaissance, if you like. There are different types of models out there. There are the more shamanic models, which some people are attracted to. It's more exotic. There's the medical model coming soon to a city near you in the UK, maybe in the next 5 years. There's a therapeutic model, which is kind of where we operate. There's a wellness model as well. But wellness is interesting. It's like I said earlier, it's that difference between, do you start to dread Monday morning on Sunday? And then do you leap out of bed on the Monday morning ready to take on the world? Or are you hitting the alarm 3 times before you get out of bed? That doesn't mean that you are mentally disordered. It doesn't mean that you have a mental health diagnosis. So how do we get people to move from just coping in life to flourishing? And I think psychedelics can play a big part in helping people flourish as well and begin to flourish.
And again, moving forward, what how far are we now from your retreat?
Yeah, since July, so yeah, like 8 months.
Yeah, and you mentioned, that we talked about like the neuroplasticity and the kind of lasting effects and the moving forward. are you carrying some of the benefits from that journey with you now? Sorry, I said journey. Are you carrying that? Are you carrying? You spoke of the kind of lasting personal insights. Is that something you're still doing? Has it factored into your day to day now?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because even just the other day, I got like a Twitter message from someone who heard me, host a radio show, and she wrote like this terrible tweet to me that was just like, "Your voice is terrible" or whatever. Or like, she really let me have it, and I was just like, "All right," you know what I mean? I was able to I think I would really like fixate on that tweet for like days normally, but in this moment, I was just like, one of these, and I just sort of like moved on, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like, good reaction, Farsad, good reaction. And I do think that has to do with the sort of like lasting impact of the mushrooms, or the sort of, you put in these habits in that 6 to 8 weeks of neuroplasticity, and that can carry through, and I was really like cognizant of that. I was like, I have these 6 to 8 weeks, I want to use them well, I want to put in good habits, and I really do think, especially dealing with like, this sort of horrible nature of like, sometimes volatile audience members, like this woman who just wants to make you feel terrible. I think I did manage to put in some good habits during that time that have carried through.
That's brilliant to hear, yeah. And yeah, you do, you can it's very evolutionary, isn't it? It's kind of, our brains have evolved to deal with threats and identify perceived threats, and what that does is amplify those tiny little tweets or a news headline or something that can really F up your day, really, if you allow it
Yes.
to.
Yes,
And
totally.
we do allow it to. I heard someone say, you could get 20 beautiful compliments in a day. Somebody could call you a wanker, for use a very English insult, on the way
Yeah.
home. On the way home, that's what you're going to talk to your partner about when you get through the door.
Exactly. You just fixate on that. And it's funny because it's sort of like, ultimately, why don't you give as much attention to the good thing as you do to the negative thing? It's like such an insult to the good thing not to give it any attention at all whatsoever. And so I think it is like letting your creating those habits, and it's really hard to create those habits when your brain is so rigid, and we're all like stuck in our ways, and but the mushrooms kind of like give you that opening to start thinking in different ways. And so, yeah. So now I'm really trying not to insult the compliments, and to like let them in just as much as I let in the insults.
Absolutely.
And there's a couple of things I'd like to add, if I may. The retreat confers all of these benefits, these experiences that you have on retreat, but it's also a catalyst. So the work truly has to continue after you get home. So one of the areas that Negin highlighted is maybe less reactivity. Okay, so you can imagine that we're all walking around with maybe a computer keyboard on our chest, and the people that we're closest to that love us all know exactly which button to press to elicit a certain response, right? And strangers can do the same thing as well. We get activated, we get triggered. And so what we tend to find is that once the emotional charge that resides within us behind that reactivity is gone through catharsis and is gone, then when the same challenges and assholes will still be at home when we get home after retreat. They're going to try pressing on certain buttons to elicit a response from you. What most people find is that they're not as reactive, don't get as activated, and can actually choose a different response, versus whereas before, if somebody pressed their buttons, they just fall into what's known as an unconscious response, that either defensiveness or attacking back, and get lost in the weeds. So that ability to choose a different response is a common outcome of the psychedelic experience as well. I'd also say, and maybe you don't strike me as an agreeable person, Negin, but you said that back when you were giving birth, you weren't advocating for yourself and asking for the epidural. Well, going back to the 5 psychology traits, we talked about the openness trait. There's also one that's called agreeableness. Now, if you're highly agreeable, that means you're easy to get along with, make friends easily, this kind of thing. But highly agreeable people also tend to be conflict avoidant and don't advocate for themselves as much as they could do. The end result of that over time is a lot of internalized anger and rage at not getting what they thought they should be deserving of in life. And so it may be that you could actually shift after a retreat, you can shift towards the middle healthy ground of agreeableness. But that means that when you get home, all the areas that you're highly agreeable in now, you've got to start changing your stance. And it can seem a bit counterintuitive to begin with, but you will find that as you become slightly more disagreeable and advocate for yourself, there's quite a sea change that can happen there as well. So I want to emphasize the work must continue after we get home.
And that's true of any kind of psychotherapy or work with our own inner selves, isn't it? You can be given all the great tools, but any book that I read in that area, anyone I've heard speaking, it prevails. You can't just kind of get back to where you were and expect this thing to be now a part of you mechanically. It's like we're organic beings, and actually, of course, we have to keep developing. But it seems to me like psilocybin and psychedelics just give you that burst of insight and on a whole nother level that enables you to come from a much deeper place moving forward.
Absolutely. I just wanted to make the points that I did because some people still perceive psychedelics as a magic bullet. And to a certain degree, it can clear up a lot of depression, PTSD, anxiety immediately. But if you just then go home and rest upon your laurels and don't change your behaviors and habits, don't be surprised if 6 months later, you're falling back in upon yourself and your old habits again. So I completely agree, Ben.
Yeah, always got to be that willingness to move forward. Brilliant. Well, I think I've covered more or less everything. This has been really eye-opening, and I really appreciate both of your time. I'm just don't know, and I'm glad that I found your comedy again because it's awesome.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much.
That's one of the biggest joys of doing this thing. It's like it starts off as a PR email and you go, oh, that sounds interesting, and then suddenly it's awesome.
That's great.
It's really cool.
Well,
and
I just want to say thank you, Ben. Great questions and a great interview style, I must say.
My pleasure. Thank you. Yeah, no, I guess it's getting back into the Jungian stuff. I'm never going to be the BBC. It would fall apart if I tried. And it's, so you go with what you know. And one of the biggest compliments anyone ever gave me was that it sounds like you're overhearing an interesting conversation in the pub.
Yes. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, it's the way I like to do it. And it's great. It helps, and you got good guests. So thank you both very kindly.
Thank you. This is so fun.
Yeah, likewise.
Great
I've had a great time.
Again, Negin.
It's great to see you, Justin.
Massive thank you once again to Negin Farsad and Justin Townsend of Myco Meditations for taking the time to come and talk to me about such a wonderful experience, a unique and forward-looking way of doing things. And it seems to be very much from what Justin said, that this is something that's going to be appearing on our radar a lot more moving forward. Really interesting about the whole thing over the years, the war on drugs, the perception of psychedelics and the kind of fear that surrounds that level of unknown. And I'll be honest, I've stayed away from that stuff throughout my life because I'm kind of concerned with the power of my imagination. And I had visions of myself plowing out of a window or all these things, and it makes you start. I mean, I'm sure that stuff is possible if they're used irresponsibly. But what's really interesting is, again, the muddling and the muddying of the waters and the kind of the image that is attached to these things. And we touched upon it in the show, but I've been to stag do's in Benidorm, and the stuff that is culturally accepted in places like that can get really bloody grotty and really damaging for the health and pretty horrible, and then something like this that's kind of under controlled circumstances and therapists and almost a spiritual experience, people look at it and go, wow, what? No, like mushrooms and all that stuff. So I don't know. It's very interesting, and there just seems to be a lot of scientific grounding, and I'm just curious to see where that goes as things move forward and more places take that on board as a potential way of tackling mental health crises and the likes. Very interesting stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'd love to get your feedback on that one. Do check out Negin's comedy. She's absolutely brilliant. I've loved following her since I learned about her ahead of the episode. Really great at what she does, very multi-talented, and she's got such a cool look as well. Go and check out her outfits and her awesome glasses. And Justin, absolutely brilliant, really great work they're doing at Myco Meditations, and what an insight there to Jungian depth psychology and things like the stoned ape theory. For you guys who've seen Fantastic Fungi on Netflix, you'll know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's mind-bending tackle. well worth a watch if you haven't seen it. Big thank you, as ever, to the loyal founding sponsor of this show, Illustration X. You can see their global range of illustrator and animator portfolios at illustrationx.com right now. And also, please do take the time to go and see the Ukrainian Institute and all the latest creative talent that are fighting so hard in war circumstances. ui.org.ua. Well worth your time. Go and have a look. If you can share some of their work, if you can dive in and learn a bit about Ukrainian culture and language and the arts there, you won't regret it. Thank you so much, guys. You can go and check out Negin's article on Afar magazine, the website. I really recommend the article. Let me find the URL for you right now while I've got you. Afar.com and search for Negin. It's afar.com/magazine. And have a look. Just search Negin Farsad Afar and you'll find it. It's a wonderful, very funny, very touching article about this healing journey that she's been on. So, yeah, something different for you there. Book launch coming up. I'll be reading a couple of excerpts from future episodes. There's more creative stories coming up. Episodes with... I'm not going to sit here and bang on. There's loads of good stuff coming up. But cheers, guys. I've kept you long enough. Thank you for checking in. Please do leave a review and subscribe to the podcast if you get a second. You don't have to write anything. Just a little star review is really, really helpful, or a rating, I should say. Tell a friend. Thank you for listening. It means the world. Cheers, guys. Take care.